QSO Today, episode 446, Rich Gussow, 4Z1JJ. This episode of QSO Today is listener-sponsored and commercial-free. Only you can keep the QSO Today podcast coming to you every weekend since 2014. Please become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor banner on the show notes page or at the top of the QSOtoday.com webpage. Beginning with episode 445, I'm recording the podcast in video format for old and new listener sponsors to view uncut from end to end without commercial breaks. If you'd like to watch the QSO Today podcast, even with closed captions for the hearing impaired, become a listener sponsor by clicking on the listener sponsor banners in this week's show notes page. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, amateur call sign 4Z1UG, where I demonstrate the diversity and relevance of the amateur radio hobby and its impact on society by interviewing ham radio operators, many of whom played vital roles in shaping our technology through the amateur radio hobby. And while many people might say, ham radio, do people still do that? This podcast demonstrates through in-depth interviews just how amazing, diverse, and dynamic the amateur radio hobby continues to be. Rich Gussow, 4Z1JJ, discovered ham radio in high school and finally got his amateur radio ticket in his first year at Brooklyn College in 1976. Single sideband is Rich's favorite mode, and he now likes working amateur satellites in voice and packet modes from his QTH in Modi'in, Israel. 4Z1JJ is my QSO Today. 4Z1JJ, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Rich?
Yes, 4Z1UG. This is 4Z1JJ. How are you, Eric?
I'm good, Rich. Thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Before we start, I just wanted to mention that Rich is a friend of mine here in Israel, and I saw him on a recent field day where he was operating his new IC705. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Rich was kind enough to agree to let me speak to him about his ham radio story. So, Rich, why don't we start at the beginning? How did it start for you?
Sure. Well, back in high school, I suddenly had this bug for electronics, just as a hobby. And I bought a Heathkit HW16 kit, which was a CW-only radio. I had no license whatsoever. I had no idea how to get a license. And I built it, made a lot of mistakes. My classmate, David Lusterman, came over and helped me fix it. And it just basically sat there for a couple of years. And after high school, I went to Brooklyn College, and there was a posting on the bulletin board. In those days, we didn't have internet, we didn't have Facebook. We had bulletin boards with real paper, and it was a ham radio course. So I said, wow, this is perfect. I'm going to sign up for it. And I did. There were about 40 of us in this class, run by W2BS Barry Summers, who was the head of the student union building there. And after a few months, I passed the novice exam, Morse code 5 words per minute, and the novice theory. And I was so gung-ho about it that within a few weeks, I went to the FCC on Varick Street, because in those days, you had to take the exam at the FCC. I tried to go for the general the first shot, but I failed the code test, the 13 words per minute code. I did pass the theory exam, so that got me a technician. And then a couple of weeks later, I went and passed my general, the code test, the 13 words per minute. And then not too long after that, I got my advanced class license, which is what I hold today in the U.S.
What do you think caused you to have an interest in electronics as a hobby only, as a teenager in high school?
So it's kind of funny. My father worked in the garment district. He had no electronics background whatsoever. My mother was a teacher, also had no idea. She barely could plug things into the wall. But what my father did have was an interest in photography. And he always bought the latest gadgets, and he kind of got me into the gadget craze. So that kind of got me into electronics, and I thought building a kit would be cool. And I had a few friends in high school who built Heathkit television sets. But I always liked the communications aspect. When I was a kid, I had these walkie-talkies that had Morse code buttons on them, and I could actually send code with my finger. I barely knew SOS, and that was about it. And that kind of sparked my interest. So I built this HW16, but it just sat there on the shelf. Actually, I never used that radio. I ended up donating it to a club station in a school. And then when this course started at Brooklyn College, that's when I really got into radio. And again, it was less of an electronics interest than more of a social speak to the world interest. I wanted to speak to people. And that was really my main driving force.
Did you have other hobbies growing up? Did you share the hobby of photography with your father?
Absolutely. I used to develop my own pictures. I went from black and white. I had to develop color slides. I got to that point. Of course, today everybody does digital, but it was a lot of work back then, and I really enjoyed it. My father had a stereo camera. It was a camera that took two pictures simultaneously, and it came out in a slide, and you had to look at it through a viewer. And it was, it had pretty cool effects from those stereo pictures. And we still have a whole package. I have a package of slides that he took on all of our trips, probably hundreds of them, tucked away here in my closet.
So you had a basement dark room?
I had a bathroom dark room because I lived in an apartment, a 2-bedroom apartment. I had no place to set up a dark room. So I went into the bathroom and tried to seal up as much light as possible coming into the dark room, and I would develop pictures there.
And what was the electronic device that he brought into your photography life that kind of triggered this interest in electronics?
So I remember before I got the HW16 when I was in high school, I was the first kid on the block to have a calculator. And my father bought this calculator that was like, newfangled. It was called Keystone. That was the name of the brand. And it had a square root function. That was really advanced in those days. And it cost like $120 for this calculator back in like 1973 or so. So, I was the first kid on the block to have a calculator. And that kind of triggered a lot of other interests, electronics and also, finance as well, which is what I went into.
As I recall, the first calculators were made by Sharp, actually, in 1972, I think. 4-function calculators. And then I think the calculator industry kind of took off in an exponential way, and they started adding scientific functions. And I think square root was probably one of the first functions that they added to the 4-function calculator.
Yeah, and I paid a premium for that, or my father paid a premium for that function.
They were expensive. I remember the Sharp calculator in 72 was over $300. $300 when the minimum wage, I think, was in $1.30 maybe, $1.40 at those days. That was a lot of money for a calculator.
Absolutely.
Okay, so you got this interest. You obviously rapidly went through the upgrades. How did it work for you in Brooklyn College when you were there? You say they also had a ham radio station there? So
they had a station, K2APZ. Had a great Collins S line, but no antenna. So it was pretty useless. Beautiful radio set, but no antenna. So we would just meet there and talk, but we didn't actually operate from there. And I became the treasurer, or co-president actually at that point, even though there was no activity going on whatsoever. You studied accounting? I studied accounting at Brooklyn College, yes. Got my CPA later, a few years later. And did you ever operate as a CPA or actually practice as a CPA? So I started working after Brooklyn College. I went to Cornell University and was recruited by Deloitte, one of the big, at the time they were big 8 accounting firms. Now it's down to 4, to work in the New York City office in the World Trade Center, 99th floor of the One World Trade Center, which of course years later anybody who was there was killed in the 9/11 attacks. Both buildings came down. Both buildings came down, yeah. You studied at Cornell University. You got an MBA there? Correct. And what happened after that? After you left Deloitte & Touche, what did you do? Well, first, to get back to Cornell, I was the treasurer of W5CXM. I was the club station there in Barton Hall, which still exists as far as I know. I visited there a couple of years ago. And I spent more time there, I think, than in school. So I was more of a professional amateur radio operator per se. But in terms of work, I worked for Deloitte for 4 years and got my CPA, and then moved on to Merrill Lynch, and then we moved to Florida in 1987. Now, all of this time, did you have a ham radio station at home? So after I got my license at Brooklyn College, I lived in a 6-story apartment building, and I was on the first floor. And I snuck with a beam antenna, I snuck a TA-33 up on the roof of this building and ran some coax down from the 6th floor down to my apartment. And it was going great for a few weeks. And then the superintendent knocked on my door, and his name was Jose. And Jose was a good friend of the family, but he was really angry that I did this without permission, because I knew if I'd asked him, he wouldn't give me permission. And he was really like, what did you put up there? He was really upset. So I took him into the shack, and Jose was from Puerto Rico. I found a couple of Puerto Rican stations on the air. He spoke to them, and then he said to me, Rich, you can put up whatever you want. I don't care.
And what was the rig that you were using?
I started off, my first rig after I upgraded to General was a Swan 500C, which was a TV sweep tube radio. I kept blowing the finals on that thing, and I eventually sold it and bought a Kenwood TS520, which at the time was a state-of-the-art almost. It was a hybrid. It was a solid-state receiver and a tube transmitter. Great radio. I bought it at Amateur Electric Supply. And I bought it. I remember the price. It was like $566 after the discount. And when you consider like the prices of radios today, $566 today would be a lot of money. Would be a lot of money today. Or back then it was a lot of money. And I think look at the radios today. Bang for the buck, you get a lot more. Like my ICOM 7300. But that was my radio, and I had this TA33 just for a few months because after the Jose gave me the okay to keep it there. A neighbor in the adjoining building who I didn't know was upset about the TVI that I was causing, and he kept cutting my coax. So I took that down eventually and put up a simpler antenna that was far away from this adjacent building, and that was okay for a while.
So you got a chance to operate in New York City?
I did, and did a lot of operating. We had, I did two main things. We had a 15-meter net at night, which was strictly ground wave because there was no propagation, and all the stations on the 15-meter net were locals in Brooklyn. N2KO, who I'm still in touch with, Rich, W82INE was there, and W82LZY, who's a friend of mine, still in touch with, who invited me over to his house for a barbecue, and there I met my future wife. So I have a lot to thank ham radio for.
Now, was your future wife a ham or just related to one?
She was not related to one. She was a part of the Cuban community, the Jewish Cuban community, and so was my friend Jeff, W82LZY. My wife was born in Israel, but her mother was born in Cuba, and they called them Jubans. And she was there because she was friendly with the family because of the Cuban connection.
How about that? I've never heard that term before.
Yeah, it's pretty common in Miami. You'll find that a lot in Miami.
When you look at pictures of New York City, and if you've got an Apple TV, when it's sitting in just picture mode, there's a flyover of New York City. And if you're not used to New York City, and I'm not, I grew up on the West Coast, it's really dense with a lot of different size buildings of different heights to tens of floors to just a few floors. Did you find that there's a large number of active hams in Manhattan itself?
So in Manhattan, we actually had a couple of repeaters. In Manhattan itself, I don't recall many friends. There were a few, but most of the hams in the New York City metropolitan area did not live in Manhattan itself. My building where I live was the tallest building in the neighborhood, so that was good for antennas.
You always think that when you're in some kind of high density, especially apartment house living, that it would be almost impossible to operate HF, ham radio. So
today we have problems with where we're interfered with by all these electronic devices. Then the problem was TVI. And I installed a high-pass filter in my building. We had a central antenna system, and I installed a high-pass filter. I bribed the technician who came to fix it one day, and he installed a high-pass filter. It was in a locked box. And that cured the TVI in my building, but it unfortunately didn't cure the TVI for my neighbor who cut my cable eventually. But it was pretty active. New York City the general metropolitan area has a fairly active, or had a fairly active ham community back then.
What was your favorite operating mode?
I started off in CW because that's how I started, and then I switched to SSB. I was doing a lot of phone patches. Interesting story there. Basically, in those days, today you don't really hear about phone patches, but these phone patches were devices for new hams that you connected the ham radio to the telephone line. And I was running there was a maritime mobile net and other nets, and I was running a lot of phone patches for people on boats and in Central America and in South America. We had third-party agreements with them, also with Israel. And in early 1979, I get a letter from the FCC asking me that information because apparently unbeknownst to me, I was running phone patches for the Jim Jones Jonestown cult. This was after the massacre there. And they wanted to get information from me about, who I spoke to and what I spoke about and whatever. And all the phone patches I did were basically apparently members of the cult, which I had no idea, talking to their families.
But this was after the Jonestown massacre.
This was right after the Jonestown Massacre.
So there were still people down there.
So no, the phone patches were being run before the Jonestown Massacre. The letter I got from the NCC was a few months after the Jonestown Massacre.
That makes sense because a lot of missionaries and other American types that were going all over the world, Africa, South America and stuff, were ham radio operators.
Correct.
Just because there was no other way to communicate.
Correct.
I remember in Israel, Israel used to have amateur stations on every kibbutz had an amateur radio station. I think that was because at the time, when I was a student here 42 years ago, it was almost $2 a minute to call the States. So ham radio was kind of this way for people to hear voices rather than spend the money.
And not only that, but in the first Gulf War, I was living in Miami, and the international long-distance lines were down. You could not call Israel. So I had all these people giving me messages to pass to their relatives to see if they were okay. And I was passing a lot of traffic back and forth between Miami and Israel to make sure that everybody was okay in Israel.
Okay, so let's move ahead a little bit. You end up moving to Florida, and what did you do in Florida professionally?
So I worked for a company that eventually moved to Cheyenne, Wyoming. I was in charge of the financial systems there, basically the liaison between the accounting department and the computer department, the IT department, and making sure that the system that we were building was appropriate and useful for the accounting department.
And what did you do ham radio-wise? Did you take the TS-520 or did you upgrade?
So I upgraded to, I think it was a TS-440 at that point. Actually, in between, I got a TS-820, I upgraded to an 820, and then I got the TS-440, which is an all-solid-state rig. And I put in Miami, we had a one-story house, and I put a Cubex quad, a two-element Cubex quad that operated on 10, 15, and 20. It was barely on the roof of my house. Again, it was only one story, and the bottom element was basically scraping against the roof practically. But I got out like a bandit. It was really a great antenna for low heights. I did a lot of DX work then. And
do you like DX work?
I love DX work. I never got DXAC until recently, but I just love to talk to different countries all over the world.
On single sideband mostly?
Almost until a few years ago, everything was single sideband, yeah.
So you're in Miami until you came here in 1994?
Correct.
Okay, and how did that happen? Your wife is from Israel. How did you end up coming to Israel?
So it was always a plan to come here. And when things looked like they were going well, like we were making peace in the Middle East, which of course was always a fleeting idea, unfortunately, there are opportunities that are opening up. The high-tech sector had just started opening up, and I wasn't in high-tech, but by osmosis, the financial sector became a very hot sector as well. So when I got here, I worked for a very low salary at the beginning, and then I immediately got a job in a new field for me, which was as a equity analyst, which was basically writing about stocks, writing research reports on Israeli stocks for foreign institutional investors like the Fidelities of the world and Vanguards and whatever, the big mutual funds. And then I was offered a job in London, and I was basically commuting back and forth between Israel and London until they let me settle in Israel permanently. And my family stayed here, and I was commuting back and forth.
I remember my first years in Israel, and commuting for the new Anglo immigrants was pretty common. Did you find that there were a lot of fellow travelers out of Israel when the weekend was over, out to wherever?
Absolutely. Every Thursday night on the British Air flight from London or the El Al flight, it was full of English-speaking citizens of Israel, like Americans, British, and whatever, going back and forth. I mean, I had it relatively easy. I have neighbors who are doctors who do that commute today, but they go to the U.S. London's a much shorter hop than the U.S., but I did it pretty much every week or two.
For a number of years?
For not really that long, for about a year, until I finally insisted that asked them if I can just be based in Israel, and they allowed it, and they found me a little office in one-man office in Ramat Gan, which is a suburb of Tel Aviv.
Where did you end up living?
So when we first came to Israel, we lived in a place called Kfar Saba. I could not put up any antennas because it was renting and I had no place to put it up. So for a couple of years, I was QRT. And then when we moved to Modi'in, we live in Modi'in today, and Modi'in, for history buffs, is where Hanukkah happened. It's a modern city built on top of the ancient city. I put up a Force 12 tri-band antenna, also just barely above my roof, and I got up really, really well. That was a great antenna. And I spoke again DX all over the world on SSB.
And how did you find amateur radio in Israel in terms of comparing it to being active in America, coming here? How did you find it?
It was more on the receive side. What I mean by that is that I was more of a target. When I was KM4JJ in Miami, I was just another American ham station. But when I was 4Z1JJ in Israel, suddenly I would get pileups. It was nice to be wanted.
So you're a wanted DX entity.
Yes.
And did you become involved in the ham radio community right away when you arrived in Israel?
So I already had a lot of friends. When I was still living in the U.S., I was on what was called the 4X net. It was an Israel net on 14320. That's where we met. And basically, it was very active. We would have Israelis and mostly American hams meeting and moving off frequency to have a chat, or maybe to do a phone patch, or to run some other form of third-party traffic. So I had a lot of base of friends here already before I got here. So I reconnected with them. I had eyeballs with some of them that I'd never met before, and I had became friendly again with some of the others that I had met several times before.
And now this mid-show break. You can keep the QSO Today podcast commercial sponsor-free by becoming a listener sponsor yourself. For $10 a month, or save 20% at $100 per year, you can become a listener sponsor. I'm now recording the QSO Today podcast as video interviews that are available only as a benefit to listener sponsors through our QSOTodayCommunity.com website. As I develop the sponsorship tier, I will add bonus content for listener sponsors. The benefit of listener sponsorship as an alternative to commercial sponsorship is that commercial sponsors influence the content and comments in the podcast. Commercial-free allows a greater degree of freedom to discuss any ham radio subject without commercial consequence. I have eliminated all commercials in the QSO Today podcast from episode 445 on, with the exception of the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, as I think it is a serious asset to a well-rounded ham radio education. I'm not using Buy Me a Coffee or Patreon anymore, but my own system for managing the community that could form out of the podcast. I direct you to the sponsorship section of the show notes pages beginning with episode 444, where I list all of the contributors to the podcast since 2014, including sponsors, donors, and hams who have paid for the transcriptions. There is a new section where I list the most recent sponsors and donors over the last 30 days. This list is generated automatically from my membership system. The new sponsors in the last 30 days are Jerry Wright, KG6VW, Scott Wright, K0MD, Dominic Tusa, K5EF, my guest in the last episode, Mark Seidel, KR3AM, and Howard Dittmer, NZ5U. New donations in the last 30 days are Robert Walsh, WA8MOA, $250, Brian Whitaker, AG6WR, $100, John Barrett, KC180T, $50, Flip to Ulster, ON7FD, $50, Paul Ecker, W2ECK, $10, Joel Holbrook, AL7PQ, $10, and John Simmons, NI0K, $10. Our funding model is now value for value, where you trade with me your time, talent, or treasure that you think values the benefit of the QSO Today podcast to you. If sponsorship is not your interest, then you can make any size donation to the podcast by clicking on the donation button on the QSO Today podcast website at qsotoday.com. There is a slider that you can use to adjust the amount of your donation. If you want to make your donation monthly, click on the recurring donation box. It is the recurring donations that keep the lights burning here. I want to thank everyone who has contributed and will contribute to my effort to create this oral history of amateur radio since 2014. It will eventually all be in the public domain for hams in the future to enjoy. Be sure to become a listener sponsor or make a donation today. And now back to our QSO Today. You mentioned that you've moved to Modi'in. Modi'in, at least at the time that it was first built, and I think they maybe continue this marketing thrust that it's kind of Israel's city of the future and it was supposed to be the first one to have fiber optic cable, but it also became very anti-antenna community, the model for the rest of the country in terms of toleration of, or lack of toleration for antennas. How did that go for you there?
So I was cited, when I had the Force 12 up, I was cited about 2 or 3 times, and apparently some neighbor complained about it. I'm not sure. I just showed them my license, and they left me alone every time. And now, when I got back into ham radio a few years ago, I put up a hex beam, and under Israeli law, the hex beam technically qualifies as long as you do certain permits as an antenna that you can put up, because it's a wire antenna held up by some, like the fiberglass, pardon me, in the hex beam. And I got a permit from the Department of Environmental Protection here, which you have to get in order to be able to put up an antenna. And I sent everything to the municipality about 3 years ago, I guess it was, and nobody's ever bothered me.
For background for the listeners, it used to be probably almost at the time that you came, cell phone companies were building across Israel like crazy, and they were building everywhere on apartment buildings and stuff like this. The amateurs got painted with the same brush as the cell phone operators, and so therefore there was no allowance for antennas from the founding of the state. Every kibbutz and every moshav, every community had a ham radio tower and beam or something like this as a way to make the overseas phone patches. But as the cell phone operators became more and more aggressive looking for antenna sites, the public developed a fear or phobia for antennas in general, and the hams got painted with that brush. But I think about 10 years ago, the Israel Amateur Radio Club actually put together legislation that they sent through the Knesset and successfully were able to release the hams from that so that they could build wire antennas up to, 9 meters high or something like that?
Something like that.
And the hex beam as a wire antenna qualified in this package. In theory, although I guess we still have yet to test this in court, in theory, a ham radio operator in any apartment building in the country has the right to put an antenna on the roof. But I think this still needs to be tested in court in order to create the precedent for a ham to survive the neighbor's wrath.
I just hope I'm not the precedent.
Well, you know what? I think that the fact that you've pulled it off in Modi'in is actually pretty cool.
With two antennas, I pulled it off.
Now, there was another ham, I think, that was also in Modi'in at the top of a building, and I think he told people that he was using his antenna for earthquake.
That's right, because like weather stations are allowed, and you can put an antenna. So there's some loophole where you can use call it a weather station, and it would be allowed. But I actually have a funny story about that. Something related to that. When I lived in Brooklyn, I had a friend who was an ultra-Orthodox Jewish ham. And he put up an antenna on his roof, and his neighbors, the ultra-Orthodox community, they wonder about certain technology. And he put up an antenna on his roof, and he told everybody that it was in order to transmit his father's EKG reports to the doctor. And that's how he got around the community influence or the community curiosity, shall we say.
Well, that's very clever. I think earthquake detection would probably be a big deal here because earthquakes are in the news in this part of the world, and Israel has, for the most part, an earthquake problem. We have an earthquake problem as long as we don't have an earthquake.
I've been through, I think, 3 of them that I felt here in Israel, and they were really strong, but fortunately caused no damage or deaths, no real damage.
I'm up in the hills, so I'm sitting on limestone for the most part, and when you have one that's coming across from east to west, it sounds like a train coming through. I'm thinking, we don't have any trains around here. And at the time that I heard this, I said, well, this is unusual to hear a train like it's coming closer. And it was this, and you felt it like, ooh, it's a wave. So growing up in California, I was used to earthquakes, but they didn't sound like that in Southern California. But here they have a unique sound to them. Let's talk a little bit more about, it's my understanding that you have an interest in satellite work.
Correct.
Can you talk a little bit about how you got interested in satellites and how you operate satellites?
Sure. Well, about 5 years ago, my son, who lives in outside of Washington, D.C., surprised me and got his extra class license. And that was a thrill. unfortunately can't operate because he lives in an HOA community, so he's very limited with his operation. But he kept saying to me, do satellite. Satellite sounds so cool. You should do it. And I did it. I got myself an ICOM 9700, and I have AZ-EL antenna that tracks satellites. And at first I started with the normal satellites like the FM satellites, the SSB satellites, which they don't have big footprints. I cover from here. I can cover, let's say, to Spain on one of the SSB satellites, linear satellites, and on the FM satellites, they tend to be a lower orbit. So I tend to speak to more like Turkey and Greece and Italy on those. But about back in November, a new satellite started operating called GreenCube, and that operates on packets. It's a packet satellite at a much higher orbit than the other satellites that we have. And I've now worked like 63 countries confirmed on that satellite, through satellites, and I have 25 states confirmed. So most of my operation now is satellite on that particular satellite.
And what does that mean, packet satellite? What does that allow you to do?
It's digital. You send digital messages, mostly the your signal report, your grid square, your call sign, of course. And after you go through a couple of series of exchanges, then you could record it as a valid QSO. And like I said, 63 countries confirmed since November on that satellite.
So you're using AX25?
So I'm using, there's a ham in Ukraine, UZ7HO, who has built a software modem. He's designed a software modem and also I'm forgetting the name of it, but another program that links to the software modems, we type the messages. And he's been upgrading it. Despite what's going on in Ukraine, he's been upgrading it. And other people have piggybacked on him and written it's a terminal program. Other people have written terminal programs that attach to his software sound modem.
So does GreenCube, it's not store and forward, meaning you can't pop a message up?
You could put a delay on it, and let's say I put in like a 5-hour delay or whatever, so it'll drop the message when it goes over a certain point, but it's not store and forward. In other words, it's not store and forward in the way we would think about it. You can put a delay, and then somebody will hear it, and then he could send another message that will be stored. And I guess in a way it is store and forward. 5 hours later, that will hit me, let's say, if you know the trajectory of the satellite. That's rarely used. It's not used so much.
It seems like you've got the gentleman's satellite situation, right? You're inside your apartment or your house. You're using the 9700. Your antenna's pointing based on the software that you've got. You're not out in the garden with a dual band.
I've done that too. On one field day that we had a couple of years ago, I went out and worked some of the FM satellites with a little Kenwood HT and an Arrow antenna, using what we call the Armstrong method, which is you don't have a rotor, you just use your arm to direct the antenna. It requires a lot of coordination, which I don't have that much of, but especially at my age these days. But it's still, I did it successfully. Do
you operate QO100?
No, I don't. I tried to, but I had so much local noise, which I've discovered the source of. So maybe I'll try it again. That I couldn't get any kind of decent signal on it. But I've discovered it was my neighbor installed new LED lights, and it killed me. So now he knows to turn it off when he's not using it. We're on very good terms. I'll probably try it again at some point.
Yeah, LED lights, like every place else in the world, have become, because I guess they're relatively cheap. They use very little power, considering the amount of lumens you get from them, but they sure make a lot of noise.
Unbelievable amount of noise. When he has his lights on, I can't work HF at all. Like it's just S7, S8 noise levels.
And what's your favorite band to operate when you're operating HF?
I don't particularly have a favorite band. When 6 meters is open, it's kind of I kind of like that because it's a relatively new band for me. I've never really operated 6 meters before. So when 6 meters is open, and we've had some good openings there, gone to South Africa and a few other places with it. So I do like that, but I don't have any particular favorite band other than that.
Do you still have skeds to North America?
No skeds, although with GreenCube, people have emailed me, getting my email address from QRZ, and they asked me to set up skeds, and I've done it because they wanted to work Israel. And I've done it with a few people, a fellow in Cuba, a couple of fellows in the U.S. So, I set up skeds that way. But again, that was on Green Cube, not on HF.
Now, are you following other satellite launches? You keep abreast on what satellites are in the sky and what you can operate?
Yeah, I try to follow with AMSAT. AMSAT has a page where they list all the active satellites, and I try to follow the news of new launches and whatever. I'd have to say that my most exciting QSO in my life was when I called when the International Space Station was over Israel, and I thought I would get Turkey or Greece or some country like that. One of the astronauts came back to me, NA-1SS came back to me, and I almost fell out of my chair when I heard that because I wasn't expecting that at all. And I fortunately, for some reason, I had this feeling. I just started recording beforehand, and I actually have it all recorded now. So I have a souvenir, plus I have the QSL card now. It's framed hanging on my wall. It was probably the most exciting QSO I've ever had.
Do you have a set time every day that you operate? Do you try to make a time every day?
So I can't say that I try to make a time every day. When I have free time, I try to get on. Usually, like maybe when the sun is setting, when signals the propagation is very interesting, can be very interesting. For satellite, it doesn't really make a difference. For satellite, I basically follow when the satellite is within range. For HF, whenever I have some free time, I'll get on.
Do you have favorite ham fests or conventions you like to go to?
So I've been to Dayton a couple of times in the last few years. I'm going again now. And Friedrichshafen in Germany, I'm going again this year as well. So those are the two that I mainly go to.
And when you go, what are you looking for?
Nothing really, but as a ham, when it's like when you're in a candy store, you don't go into a candy store knowing what you want, but you see something and you say, I should get that. Some interesting gadgets, I think, is what I would be looking for these days. I'm not looking for any particular radio or anything like that, but sometimes they've got interesting gadgets, antennas, whatever that I can play with. But it's mostly a social thing for me.
Well, I noticed that you're operating, at least in the field, you're operating in the new IC705, which is a beautiful portable radio. How do you find operating QRP? You're used to operating a little bit more power, I think.
Yeah, I think with the new digital modes like FT8, it closes a lot of the gaps with the higher powered radios when you're in the field. So I mostly operate in QRP like on FT8, and it gets the job done. 10 watts can go pretty far on FT8.
Now, we've done our Anglo group that we don't get together nearly as much as we should, but when we do, we're operating on the side of the road, usually in some kind of park. Are you doing more parks on the air these days, or have you thought about operating SOTA or POTA in Israel?
So I haven't done that yet, aside from we went down to the Timna down south, where it was a QO100 thing that we did, an operation that we did a couple of years ago, just before COVID. And I brought my satellite arrow antenna and my FM radio. So I operated a little satellite, and the other guys were operating QO100, and we had a good time. It was more, again, I think for me, it was more social than anything else.
Just for the people in the Western Hemisphere, QO100, which telecom company is it?
It's a stationary satellite, a geostationary satellite that covers from Brazil. It's Qatar, I think.
Qatar, right. So it's Qatar Telecom satellite.
And it covers from Brazil to Thailand, something like that, some incredible range like that.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. From the east coast of Brazil. So Rio de Janeiro, Sao Paulo, I think, are included in the footprint, right on the edge, all the way over to, you're right, to India. It's quite amazing. And I think it wasn't the German Amateur Radio Club, I think, that kind of worked out the details with Qatar to put this, essentially provide this transponder service.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's really an amazing satellite.
So there's a lot of Israelis on it. I have all the pieces that I need to put together in order to make this work. The problem is I spend so much time planning a project. The planning is longer than actually just putting it together. That's
often the case. I also have all the pieces because I took it down after I had this noise level, but now that I fixed the noise level, I'll try it again one day.
I hope to work you on it, although I probably could work you on 15-meter ground wave from here or something like that.
I'm sure.
What most excites you about ham radio now? I mean, you've been in it for a long time, since, 1976?
Right.
That's a good long time. It's almost 50 years.
Yeah, makes me feel old, actually. I mean, I remember when I got my license, it seems like yesterday, and I don't know where the almost 50 years went. But I think the beauty of ham radio is that after you may get bored with doing some facet of ham radio, let's say I get bored with satellites after a while, I've done everything I can, there's always something else to do. There's always something new or something old to go back to. I used to do a lot of public service, like I said. Maybe I would do more of that. The old days it was phone patches. I also, when I was living in New York, I worked the New York City Marathon, which was a lot of fun. And I also, the Israel Day Parade, there was a funny story back around 1980. I was volunteering for the Israel Day Parade in the communications sector. They have a whole bunch of hams that work there every year, and they still do. And Menachem Begin, who was the former prime minister of Israel, was visiting, and he was sitting in the grandstands. And for whatever reason, they put me right up front. I was stationed up front, right behind the horses. So I had to be very agile in that position. Because, but unfortunately, the marching band that was right behind them, they couldn't be agile. They had to stay in formation, and they weren't so lucky. But I remember suddenly over the radio, we were using 2-meter radios, they said, Menachem Begin wants to talk, stop the parade. So I ran in front of the horses, put my hand up like this, and 100,000 people stopped behind me. It was a big power trip for me. I've never felt so powerful in my life.
Being able to stop a parade?
100,000 people.
Yeah, although it seems to me that marching band behind horses, that's why they have spats, right, on their shoes?
I guess, but they didn't seem to be too happy about having to stay in formation.
What do you think we could do better to attract more people into the hobby?
First of all, I think we don't have enough activity on the repeaters. I think that's everywhere. Where we're using WhatsApp a lot more than radio. I think we need to do a lot more work on the radios itself, and rather not using social media, or at least reduce it. We got to get into the schools. I think the schools is really where you're going to find interest. And yeah, they say kids, they have internet, they're not interested. But I think the Germans do it pretty well. I've been to Friedrichshafen a couple of times, and there's always these youth groups in Germany that come, and they're really excited and exuberant about it. And I think they have the right idea. I don't know how successful it is, but I think that's where we got to go. And into the schools, have club stations in the high schools, which we used to have, and the colleges and whatever. And that's what's missing today. I don't think there's as much activity as it should be.
I think that the Israel Amateur Radio Club is very active at the Herzliya Science Center, which is a science high school, but it's only one of many across the country where probably we aren't. Do you know anything about the German program in terms of what is it that's attracting them? Are they doing robotics or something like that?
I honestly don't know, but I just see a whole bunch of enthusiastic teenagers there at Friedrichshafen every year.
There's also a lot of CW or Morse code, not on the air, but Morse code proficiency contests that young people do in Europe that I don't think that you see in America.
I've read articles that Morse code is coming back. In the general press, I've read about it, that it seems to have this attraction for a lot of people, and including young people.
I want to take a minute to tell you about my favorite podcast, the Ham Radio Workbench Podcast, with George, KJ6VU, and now joined by Rod, VA3ON, Mike, VA3MW, Mark, N6MTS, and Vince, VE6LK. Every 2 weeks, George and company offer up a status report on the many amateur radio projects on their workbenches and explore projects on their guests' workbenches. This group is project active and prolific, covering many technical areas of amateur radio. So the next time you want a deep dive into ham radio electronic project building, or to learn about technology, tools, test equipment, construction techniques, and the rest, listen to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, available on every podcast player and channel. Use the link in this week's show notes page to get to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast directly. And now back to my QSO. Is there a new operating mode or something that you would like to try that you haven't tried yet that's coming up?
Well, QO100 I'd like to try again. I'd like to try to get back on that again. But I remember the old days of Packet. Like when now I operate the satellite, but I used to love Packet radio. It was before we had emails were so popular, where I would get on my Packet radio and send messages through a whole linkage system. There was no internet involved, and would go over VHF and HF. It would take a couple of days for my messages to get to the final destination. But I would speak to Rich 4X1DA, who was a mutual friend of ours, all the time. It would take, again, a couple of days between messages, but it was pretty cool to have that go through this whole relay system. I'd love to see that come back one day. So far, it's really, I don't see it happening so quickly, but it was one of my favorite modes of operation years ago.
Well, it seems like that would be replaced by Arden or something like that now, where you're converting essentially access points, Wi-Fi access points to amateur radio frequencies and sending data this way. I guess the data packets are much larger and the bandwidth is much larger, so we could probably send pictures and video and stuff like that. What do you think about that as a project to do? I don't want to cause you to commit to a project, but do you think you'd have an interest in something like that?
That sounds interesting, and I'm not a technical person, but I think I would be happy to get involved in something like that, yes.
You have a modest workbench?
Very modest, but yes, I do.
You can fix the things you have.
Absolutely, I've done it. I've done it too. I don't have that much technical knowledge, but if it just requires soldering a joint here or there, no problem whatsoever.
Do you have advice that you'd give to newer returning hams to the hobby?
Well, I was a returning ham. I was off the air for about 10 years. And I think the reason I got back was that Rich, again, 4X1DA, he gave me a DMR radio as a thank you for helping with his tax return a few years ago. And that got me back into radio. But in terms of returning hams, just use whatever interests you. There's so many things in ham radio that could be of interest. You've got the old technology like SSB that you've used, CW, digital modes you could use. There's so many things that so many choices you have. And that if you get tired of one, you can shift to another. The satellites are great as well. I love the satellites. So I would say just, get into as many modes as possible that you like. And if it gets boring at some point, switch to the other one.
Rich, I want to thank you so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. This was fun. I'm glad to connect with fellow hams in Israel because we all have different experiences here, good and bad. It depends upon where you live and how your neighbors react to you. I think we're both fortunate, it sounds to me, that we have neighbors that for the most part leave us alone and don't cause too much of a fuss. In most places, I think these days, that's a real godsend.
Absolutely. Absolutely. My neighbors actually love to hear my stories, my ham radio stories, and they were very excited to hear the recording of the contact with the ISS. So they're into it as well. Maybe one of them will become a ham one day.
When you mention it like that having these stories to tell to people, because most people, when you mention ham radio, there's kind of this blank stare. It doesn't have the recognition that it once had because we've been eclipsed by cellular telephones and the internet and everything else. But I think the stories are good. Anyway, I want to thank you so much for joining me and wish you 73.
73, Eric. Thank you.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Rich. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in 4Z1JJ in the search box at the top of the page. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any of the episodes into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing on the subscribe buttons on the show notes page. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes pages. Your value for value support is recognized on the QSO Today podcast and in the weekly show notes. Use our Amazon link when you shop on Amazon. Clicking on this link before you enter Amazon will allow Amazon to pay us a small commission on what you purchase. This is a very painless way to support the QSO Today podcast. QSO Today is syndicated on every podcast platform, including Spotify and the iTunes Store. Until next time, this is Eric 4Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.